Hello. On behalf of the CEO Circle of Color, welcome to today's forum, 2021 Bold Leadership for Racial Justice. My name is Justin Goddard, and I serve as Senior Program Officer with Community Progress. And it's a pleasure to have you all with us today. As we get settled and go over a few housekeeping items, we invite all guests today to share who you are and where you are joining us from in the chat. Please feel free to engage other attendees throughout the forum. We are recording today's event, so please be respectful during our time. Before turning it over to our esteemed speakers, I have a few logistical items to share. Please submit questions for our speakers by using the Q&A icon in Zoom. We will share a video recording of today's forum in the coming days. If you experience any technical difficulties, please send a message to our team by clicking on the chat icon or by sending an email to myself at jgoddard@communityprogress.net. Again, welcome to the CEO Circle of Color Forum. We are glad you are here for this important convening. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Hala Farid.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? I'm Hala Farid with City Community Investing and Development. Thank you for joining us. We're very fortunate today to have a forum that features 6 exceptional, tenacious, dynamic, and resourceful leaders of color who lead 6 of the largest nonprofit organizations in the country. Each one of them is inspiring individually, but together they form a most powerful platform that advocates for centering racial equity, as my friend Lisa said, in programs, leadership, in partnerships, and collaborations in business, government, and philanthropy. They lead with a deep and profound understanding of the communities they serve, realizing their burden is much bigger than the average CEOs, and that in addition to all they do and will continue to do, they must make sure the doorway of opportunity, as the former First Lady Michelle Obama said, stays open, and that other folks have the same chances that help them succeed. Their decisions and work individually and collectively are critical to people's self-determination and aspirations. I'm honored and humbled to be a part of this forum today, which consists of 3 panels. Each will explore an important topic and is led by a distinguished moderator. It is now my pleasure and honor to introduce you to our first panel's moderator, Brandy McHale, Head of Community Investing and Development at Citi and President of the Citi Foundation. She leads Citi's efforts to drive economic opportunity and invest in the equitable and inclusive growth of communities through impact investing, inclusive finance, community relations, and the philanthropy of the Citi Foundation. I've had the pleasure and honor of working with Brandy for the past 20 years. And when I tell you, there couldn't be a more humble, approachable, kinder leader that you can work for. So it's truly an honor and a pleasure to introduce her. Brandy.
Thank you so much, Hala. I really appreciate that. And you know that the feeling is so mutual. For those of you that know Hala, you know that this is an incredible person. So thank you for everything you've done to make today happen and to bring us all together. I am joined today by 6 amazing leaders. We have Calvin Gladney from Smart Growth America, Tony Pickett, Grounded Solutions Network, Marietta Rodriguez, NeighborWorks America, Maurice Jones, Local Initiatives Support Corporation, LISC, Lisa Rice, National Fair Housing Alliance, and Akila Watkins, Community Progress. They all represent our nation's leading community development organizations. Each has incredibly impressive backgrounds. I hope if you don't already know them, you'll have a moment to look at their bios. But perhaps more important than their backgrounds and their experience is that each has a really bold and forward-looking vision of what is possible in our world. And we need that vision. And I'm so grateful for the chance to talk with them today. Preparing for our panel, I was thinking about what connects all of you through the CEO Circle of Color. And while you do all each lead innovative, results-focused organizations, and we do want to spend time this afternoon learning more about your organizations and your work, there is, I think, something that binds you together. There is a common element. And for me, it's that each of you are what I would describe as superhero change agents. So I hope all of you that are joining us today, when you're asked how you spent February 25th, you can say my workday was spent hanging out with real life superheroes. And our conversation today is designed to get to know each of you better, both as leaders of your organizations, but as change agents. So I think we should just jump right into it. And Tony and Akilah, why don't we start with you? Why don't you tell us about the CEO Circle that's connected you to one another and what it has meant to you and your organization? Which one of you wants to start?
Thank you, Brandy. Really appreciate the introduction. And I'm happy to be here with my esteemed colleagues. And so I am really excited about this conversation and to talk about the importance of the CEO Circle and what it's meant for an organization like Community Progress. About 3 years ago, the field of community development was shifting. And what we began to see were more leaders of color achieving leadership positions of national organizations. And that excited, I know, me and some other folks that are on this phone call that you're going to be introduced to today. And so we didn't want that moment to just go by, right? We really wanted to, first of all, take a breath. Second of all, really figure out, how the field of community development has changed and will change with more leaders of color at the helm. What does that mean in terms of our perspective, how we approach the work, the sort of resources we're able to obtain? And then importantly, how do we leverage those resources across the field? We all took leadership roles at one of the most turbulent times in the field. And so I think that one of the most powerful things about the CEO Circle was that we didn't let that stop us. We actually came together, created, I think, deep and meaningful relationships with one another that really were based on supporting each other in our new roles, but also understanding that resources are finite. And so and the question is like, how do we better leverage across our organizations? And how do we do the important work of revitalizing and building communities in more equitable ways? And how do we do that together? And so that's the one thing that really, I think, excites me about the CEO Circle and what it has meant for an organization like Community Progress. It means that I'm able to grow our impact and influence and sphere of influence by working with these amazing leaders around the table. And so let me just pass it on to my partner, Tony.
Thanks, Akilah. And again, I'm so honored to be here as the leader of Grounded Solutions Network and to be among my colleagues and peers for this critical conversation. I just want to add to what Akilah said. On a human level, all of this has been, for me, the best unexpected gift. It's organic, it's a personal learning journey, it's a bonding experience with other leaders of color, and that's a rare occurrence throughout my years in the community development sector. So this is a moment to mark. There's also this bigger aspect of positive disruption. We've literally formed our own support and decision-making table. And that's not just relevant, that's a radical step towards realizing our own collective power. And we haven't done that alone. There's been facilitators, Marcus Littles, I just want to lift him up, the founder of Frontline Solutions, he came into the process early on and really challenged us to push our thinking towards radical transformation, and also grounded us. And again, to have another leader of color of a national nonprofit organization doing that on our behalf is a wonderful experience. And the circle also sends a really clear signal to my staff, board, and partners, and all the communities of color we serve. Really, when I am out talking about our Grounded Solutions goal of lasting affordability in housing now, 1 million new units over the next 10 years, this circle is a key part of the strategic partnerships that I need to bring to the table in order to achieve that goal. So I'm just really thankful to be a part of this. And our circle is really modeling the trust and the power sharing that we need to realize transformative change in place-based work. And all of that is really powerful in a way that just feels like progress. And I've heard that reflected in many of the internal and external conversations that I've had over the last couple of years.
This is really, it's an interesting point. You came together during a time where there was lots of disruption, but also to further support your ability to disrupt what was happening. And, you know, what I'm hearing is that clearly this is a time for cooperation, collaboration, not competition. And we're going to come back to that theme in a moment. But I do think that, especially in a field where, you know, financial resources are in scarce supply, I really want to point out something you both said, which is that this was an opportunity to amplify and to realize that by coming together with your own individual strategies, you could actually accomplish more. So we're going to keep digging into this. Let me turn to Lisa and Calvin. So you both took over took the leadership role in your institutions in the same year, in 2018. Boy, who knew 2018 was going to seem so like nice and comforting at the time? I know 2018 didn't feel that way. And while the world was really different just that short time ago, we weren't in the midst of a health pandemic, but the crisis of inequality and disparity was certainly having debilitating impacts. So can you talk a little bit about and share how, as leaders, your thinking has changed since then, and what it takes to be change agents and leaders of color during this moment in our country? And Calvin, why don't we start with you?
Thank you. So awesome to see my colleagues here visually. Hope to see you soon, sometime in 2098 or whenever we're able to convene again. I would say, thinking back to 2018 and now, 3 things come to mind and how my mindset has changed. One is that I've gone from focusing on equity to really thinking about restorative justice. The second, I would say, is knowing as a leader, particularly a leader of color, that you can't wait for consensus. And then finally, and this has been very helpful to me in these last couple of years, learning more and knowing about the history, and leveraging that to think about solutions and not just making up solutions and being ignorant of the details that have happened before. So, you know, and just super quickly, thinking about going from equity to restorative justice is sort of the difference about thinking about solutions that create jobs to thinking about how do we incorporate wealth building into what we do, so that we're just not handing someone a fish or teaching them how to fish, we're teaching them how to own a fish market. In terms of consensus, we just, as an example, did an equity summit a couple of weeks ago, sponsored by Citi, so thank you. And we had about 4,000 people sign up, almost 2,500 people individually attend. And it wasn't something that somebody was asking for. We said, this is the time to talk about these issues, and we're not going to wait for a consensus about what the topic should be, who should be there. We just went out and did it. And then finally, just knowing the history. A lot of people, as an example, have read How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. But, and I'll go to my bookcase, not as many people have read Stamped from the Beginning, which is the definitive history of racist ideas in America. And a lot of people have read The Color of Law, but not everybody has read The Color of Money by Mirza Baradam, which talks about the history of Black banks in America. And the things I've learned recently is you can create better solutions and understand where people sit that have different lived experience if you have a more granular sense of the history and how things happened and how the system was designed, and then design a new system that takes into account that history.
I love this frame of recognizing that we can't forget the past. We need to learn from it in order to move forward. But moving forward, I think this is really powerful, that we can't wait for consensus. I think far too often, especially when we are working in a space where we don't have all the answers, that's incredibly uncomfortable, especially as a leader, you're expected to have all the answers. And so I would just add a friendly amendment to that. I love this. They can't wait for consensus. And we also can't wait to feel like we have all the answers. It's okay to start to, step forward boldly. Lisa.
Yeah, I'm loving this whole thread of understanding the history and knowing the history, because it is the history, it is what has happened before that is shaping where we are today and impacting where we are today. So this has been, your question is one that is really caused me to do some deep thinking and sort of reflecting here. Because for me, I don't know about, and I think it's true for my colleagues as well, this has been a whirlwind.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very unique moment. It is not like any other moment that I've ever experienced in my 40-year career. And I too have been reminded more and more of the history, but more so in terms of those on whose shoulders we stand. Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells, and what it has meant for me to be a change agent in this particular moment. First we had the COVID pandemic that happened, and then we had the murder of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and so many others that really shone a light on the structural barriers that lock people out of opportunities. And more specifically, the systemic racism that still grips our nation. So Brandy, during this past spring, summer, and fall, I fielded a lot of calls from other senior executives and lots of executives from industry stakeholders, financial services institutions, and those executives are trying to understand why this moment was happening and what it meant for those institutions. So what it has really, frankly, meant for me to be a change agent is taking a lot of calls at midnight and over the weekend, talking to other leaders about this moment, about why this moment was happening, about why we were seeing disparities coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, and what they could do as leaders to be change agents in their own institutions. And I think one of the most watershed moments for me happened this summer when a number of lending institutions whose senior executives I had been having all of these conversations with took a very pivotal change on their stance on disparate impact, which is a very fundamental civil rights tool that we use to effectuate systems change. Before this summer, those financial institutions were, I would say, really opposed to disparate impact. They had a complete about face in terms of their positioning on this critical civil rights tool. So having conversations about systems change issues like that, to conversations about just things like how they should be talking to their employees. I can remember numerous conversations with people about whether or not they should use the term Black Lives Matter when they were talking to their employees about this unique moment that we were finding ourselves in. So I just think that the willingness to be called upon and to step up to the plate when you're called upon, even when it's not convenient for you, has been a critical element, I think, of leadership in this particular time.
So I would be remiss if I didn't say that I have no doubt that we were probably one of those midnight phone calls. If we weren't midnight, we sure as heck were probably 7 a.m. So thank you for that. But you know, you point out something that has been, I feel it, something that's been really different about this time period, which is that I feel like I've always been here to represent my institution and to think about my institution's response, and also spent a lot of time in philanthropy thinking about systems and how we change systems, as though I was outside of all of this, as though my role as an individual and a person was sort of separate from my role in the institution. And what started to happen, and I think what you're pointing out, is you can't not think about your role as an individual and how we got here. And that's not something that you're typically probably used to counseling, you know, entities who are either funders or can influence policy, and talking to them about sort of, you know, you have to be the coach, the therapist, the change agent, all those things. So yeah, it really incredible time. So thank you for sharing that, and for the midnight phone calls. Maurice and Marietta. So we've known each other a long time, and our organizations have worked together a really long time. And you know, it's interesting. When I was learning about the CEO circle, I was so excited to see that you were both in the circle, because your institutions are so outsized. You know, they're the scale and the breadth. So you do represent two of the largest institutions here today. I want to come back to this issue of collaboration and competition. You could definitely see yourselves potentially as competitors. I've not seen you show up that way. So talk to us about, what does it really take to collaborate versus compete? Go ahead, Mary.
I'll jump in. What I would say is our ability to get around a table and work collaboratively has taken us to a new level of intentionality. We've had to show up very intentionally, and sometimes you're right, there are times that we are competitors, but I think this focus on intentional collaboration. But the other thing that I would point out that actually you mentioned, Brandy, a little bit earlier, it also takes us showing up with some vulnerability, right? We don't have all of the answers, particularly right now when issues are so tender in communities. There is a lot of pain and struggle, and times are so unsettling. Really showing up with some vulnerability, I think, has really helped us not only build a trusting foundation, but a relationship that I think can be long-term. And I think when you think about collaboration, collaborative opportunities don't always show up every day. And there are times when they show up and it forces two entities to collaborate. If you don't have a really strong foundation underneath that, it can sometimes be difficult to establish the relationship and collaborate at the same time. I think the intentionality and the work that we've done to develop our relationships here we will feel and leverage for many years to come. So I think I wanted to point that out. I also think we all bring different strengths to this circle and to the discussion and to the solutions. We're not all the same. And so I think that creates a very rich environment for strategy and cross-pollination, which I think is amongst us and our organizations, which I think is really important. But I also don't want to discount competition, because competition can make us better, can make us more efficient, can make us more productive. And so I think it's okay to also acknowledge that there is a little probably of competition, and we can all be better and stronger for it. So those are the reflections as I think about your question. But I have to say, I'm so grateful and thankful for leaders like you and Hala for supporting us getting together around this table, because we certainly couldn't do it without your support.
Thank you.
I would look, I'm not in Marietta's league, so I can't compete with her. So I'm just going to take that off the table to begin with. But I also echo her thanks to you all for your support. I think, 2 or 3 things jump out at me in terms of how the circle has benefited me and helped on this issue that you're talking about now. One is, in all honesty, I knew everybody before we came together, but the circle has definitely created more of a sense of caring about one another as individuals than I believe we had beforehand. And so I really am just grateful for that, because, there's no ambiguity. I care about each one of my teammates here and vice versa. And I remember getting a call from one member here about an issue that she was facing in a local market. And in all honesty, she explained it to me, and I didn't know what the issue was, but I didn't care. What I knew was she wasn't happy about it, and I was going to do something to try to be helpful to her. Well, but for us coming together in this circle, I'm not sure that would have been my first feeling, my first emotion, but it was here. Somebody I cared about was unhappy about something. That's all I needed to know. I didn't need to know anything else. So that's one thing. The second thing is it's created, I believe, a real bond of trust that enables us to also work together. And all of this is stemming from the third thing. I was raised by grandparents, and they were by far the most influential folks in my life, even to today. The real currency was proximity, was the fact that I got to be next to them and near them, and what they and who they were and what they were and what they cared about. It was contagious. It rubbed off on me. The circle has created proximity for us. And that has really, really enabled us to want to do stuff together as a collective and to be powerful together. So I'll never be able to compete with Marietta, but I love her dearly. And the circle has been by far the biggest contributor to that piece.
As you're both speaking, and all of you, I'm just reminded how important it is. Relationships matter. It's like the power of relationships matter. And great organizations they're not really a thing. Organizations are just people, and people coming together. And I just so appreciate the modeling that you're doing, because I know if we looked at the calendar that each of you, Marietta, Maurice, all of you, if we looked at your calendar, be like, how have you found the time to do this and made the space? But I'm so glad that you have. We need to do more of that. Mm-hmm.
I left out one thing. The first gathering, which I might have skipped, was food. Somebody was going to buy us food. And so I'm like, I don't pass up free meals. So that got me to the table. So I do want to encourage folks that free meal thing is a good way to start a circle.
Okay, I'm gonna modify my opening because even superheroes need to eat. That's my friendly amendment to it.
Gotta have it.
Well, and
Yeah.
I would say Maurice is being modest because he was on his way to Detroit and planned a stopover
Yes.
to join us around the dinner table. So again, it was that sort of intentionality, like, and commitment.
So I know we only have a few more minutes left, but I want to get everybody back in at least one more time here. And I've, done a lot of panels, and a typical question is, so as leaders, what keeps you up at night? But I really want to flip it around and think about positivity and being optimistic. And so I'm going to ask you the flip side of that question, which is, what is it that excites you and makes you want to jump out of bed in the morning and keep going at it? What's motivating you? And you know what? I'm going to do it random. I'm going to go random here. So why don't we start with you, Lisa?
Sure. What excites me is that for the first time, I have seen so many people, different stakeholders, galvanized around the idea and the real possibilities for creating systems change, for creating real opportunities for people that are truly equitable. I've never seen that before, and that jazzes me.
Great. Tony?
Yeah, I would say, we're experiencing a really unprecedented surge of interest in really examining approaches to scale our approach of community control of land with community land trusts and shared equity housing models. And so, Brandy, I just want to amplify something you said earlier, that there's a sense of urgency to act with this intentional collaboration. And that's reflected in the work we're doing, for instance, with NeighborWorks. They just had an incredible shared equity symposium that we participated in, and all the feedback that I received was overwhelmingly positive. The Center for Community Progress with Aquila, our catalytic land cohort, we are inundated with calls expressing interest in learning about the approach and supporting the application of it in various places across the country. Even the GSEs, Freddie and Fannie, they are really leaning into our work and saying we have to find ways to expand access to home ownership and provide better access to mortgage finance that advances racial equity in this work. And so I just really am excited by the whole national conversation and focus around this idea that we can reinvent and transform the systems that have impeded communities of color for so long.
Great, thank you. Marietta?
Such a great question. I would say two things. I think that the thing that binds us all together is something that we've known for a long time, and that is housing and your home is at the core of communities and of community stabilization and healthy neighborhoods. And we are having a moment right now where housing is in almost in every conversation, whether it's response to the terrible storms we saw in the Mid-South in Texas last week, if it's the pandemic where people are forced to work from home, educate their children from home, even access telehealth from home. The housing inequities that communities of color, some rural communities are facing, we've all been working on that. And what's exciting is there is a lot of energy and creative innovation that is coming, and investment that's coming together to address these issues. So I think that that's incredibly exciting. I would also say that, I lead an organization that resources more than 240 locally based organizations who are on the front lines every day. And those organizations are doing incredible things in the face of great adversity and challenge. And if we can help invest and provide resources, that's incredibly exciting to me.
Thank you. Calvin?
What's exciting to me is that we're willing to use the R word. We're willing to talk about race. We've all spent many years dancing around what we were really talking about here. And I echo everyone's sentiments about system and systems level change. But what we often were unwilling to do at a macro level was to say, this was about a system that was designed to create racially inequitable outcomes. So you can't change a system that's designed in that way with sort of race neutral solutions and thoughts. And so, I was on, even on Twitter at Smart Growth CEO, no shame there. I was able to write, I just put out a tweet that said, hey, anybody here around the country has ever had a highway built through a Black and brown neighborhood on purpose by design? And literally got almost 1,000 responses. And it's almost like a bibliography of race-based transportation infrastructure designed to hurt the social and economic fabric of Black and brown communities. And so I mention that because, one, we now can be explicit about race and how we have to have race-based, at least analysis to understand what are the appropriate solution sets. And two, going back to this circle, allowing us ways to work together, one of the things we propose not only is various federal funding strategies to think about how to move highways out of neighborhoods and how to reclaim the land, but then I was just talking to Tony the other day is, why wouldn't we also append to that a land trust solution that says, again, it's not just about equity, that we don't want neighborhoods that go, highways that go through neighborhoods, but restorative justice would say, what was lost economically from a health standpoint, from a social standpoint, from the people in these neighborhoods? And if we think about what was lost, how do we restore that? And one way is to say, if we bring new land and land value to the table, how can we take that wealth creation, wealth building moment and give it to the community that's there? So talking about race to me is exciting because now we're getting to the crux of some of the problems.
Yeah, thank you. Akilah.
So there are a couple things. One, I'm so excited about the new political environment we exist in. When I took over Community Progress, so much of my work then was about playing defense, right? We didn't want to lose ground. It didn't create a lot of space to dream and to be innovative, right? And I think that as the political environment has changed, I think there's a lot more interest in issues that are really important to me and the circle: affordable housing, land use, how do we shore up municipal government budgets? Like, that's important. And I feel like we can begin to think about the future now and play some offense and dream and be radical in our thinking, right? Around what does it mean to build in a post-COVID world. And so that gets me excited again. I just don't want us to have to keep the trains on the tracks as leaders. I think part of our job as leaders is to innovate, is to inspire, is to leave things better than what we found it. I think, and Calvin talked about, I love the fact that we can talk about race and be explicit about it. I also love the fact that I can lead a national organization as a Black woman and be in my fullness as that. I don't know if that could have been possible 10 years ago, but it's possible now. And I enjoy that. That keeps me up. That gets me excited. I think it creates a whole host of inspiration for other Black women that want to lead and want to lead on a large scale. And so I love the way, again, the environments are shifting and allowing people, again, to be in their fullness as leaders. We don't have to show up one type of way anymore. So I'm excited about that.
Thank you. All right, Maurice, bring us home here. I'm getting the hook on the time, but I want you to get the,
I'll be quick. I'm excited about this season of protest that we're in right now in the country. You know, for the longest time, I think the greatest risk to the American project is our ability to be at peace with injustices. And so right now we're in a season of protest. People are protesting racial injustice. They're protesting the wealth gap and the health gap and the opportunity gap between races and between places. That's how we make progress. So I'm excited about this season of protest that we're in. And I want to leverage this season for the maximum that we can do to eliminate these disparities that we've had in this country since day one.
Well, you all have done something also that is very rare, which is that you've left the funders speechless. I have nothing to say. I've said it all. Hala, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you all.
Thank you for your thoughtful answers and comments. It's truly an honor to be a part of this. And it's also an opportunity to transition to our next panel, which is going to be led by Scott Spencer, Associate Director, Local Policy, Foundation's work in advancing community-focused policies, practices, and strategies that increase opportunities for children, families, in the places where they live and foster their successes. Spencer also coordinates Casey's local advocacy efforts in Baltimore. Before taking on these roles, Spencer managed Casey's investments in East Baltimore, where the foundation has worked to strengthen community and economic development in a historic, low-income neighborhood next door to the Johns Hopkins University Medical Campus. He previously was the transportation specialist at the Environmental Defense Fund, where he focused on state-level smart growth policy and commuter choice, a local tax incentive for people who use transit. He also served as Deputy Director for Historic East Baltimore Community Action Coalition. There, he led the Federal Bridge to Work demonstration, which provided job training and placement services for residents in East and West Baltimore, as well as transportation from their neighborhoods to employment centers in the suburbs. In addition, he worked for several years in private architectural practice, community development, and university relations in upstate New York. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Spencer.
Thanks so much, Hala. And I bring you greetings from my hometown of Baltimore, which is also the ancestral lands of the Susquehannock, the Piscataway, and the Lenape tribal nations. And I'm really glad to have this conversation with Akilah, Calvin, and Maurice. To paraphrase a statement from our Vice President, you folks may be the first of your generation to be leaders in your organizations, but definitely based on your leadership of your organizations, you will not be the last. And I really want to thank you for that. But, you know, as leaders of color, you know, and this sort of follows up on where Calvin was, you know, picking up on, you know, leading with race and racial equity, and how as leaders of color, you know, coming into this role, you may be expected to be the racial saviors, the racial, you know, the promoters. And that comes with, you know, both benefits and burdens. And so I just want to ask each of you to really share with us something that's been like really rewarding about being unapologetic and leading in racial equity. And also, what has been a challenge of doing that from your positions and your viewpoints? Calvin, why don't you start out?
Ooh, there's so much there. We could do a whole panel just on that question. One, I just want to echo, and I love when I get to talk with my colleagues because they always say such awesome things. I'm like, I really need to take notes. And what Akilah just said earlier about the ability to show up as your full self, to me is one of the more rewarding things of being able to lead and talk about racial equity. You know, we all bring, not just as leaders, but as leaders of color, a specific lived experience. And I think Brandy mentioned this as well, but you oftentimes had this sort of bifurcated life where you were a leader in community development, and then you had lived experience, but you weren't able to bring that lived experience to the table as a substantive part of the conversation. And now you can do that. So for me, that's just very rewarding to be able to bring lived experience to the table. I mean, I grew up in public housing in Brooklyn. Shout out to Brooklyn if anybody's from there. or live there now. We accept you too, even if you just moved there. So I'm able to bring that to the table in those experiences, whereas before that might not have been welcomed. And then on the challenging side, I would say there's a little bit of a flip side of that, which is all of us have these great backgrounds, education, and technical substantive knowledge. But there is, as a leader of color, I'll speak for myself, I don't know if others feel this way too, a concern that when you are leading and you're talking about racial equity, that people presuppose that you don't actually have other technical knowledge and abilities and capacity, and that, as some people say, you're just a race man, or you know a lot about protesting about racial issues, but you don't have this technical experience and capacity to come with it. And so for me, that's a challenge because of two things. One is having the understanding of how to deal with issues of racial equity is technical expertise in and of itself. So you have to sort of explain that to folks. But then two, we've all done some things and bring some skills to the table that have nothing to do with race and nothing to do with that lived experience alone. So having that balance where folks, sometimes you have to let people know that, no, I was a real estate developer, I was a consultant, I've been a government official, I've done those things. And so when I talk about stuff, it's not just because I'm great on policy and ideas. I'm not just a thought leader, but we actually know what we're talking about substantively as well.
All right. Akilah?
So, everything Cal said, I'm in absolute agreement with. I think the thing that is the most frustrating, I'm gonna start there first, is that I just think people think you can take a lot. Like, I think that sometimes people think you can do more with less, that you always have the capacity to just take on burdens, to listen more than you probably should ever do. It's a lot. It's a lot. And we have learned, probably more so than this year, but we know this if you're in bodies like mine, like I'm in a Black body, that, it's difficult to live in this country, in this world, and be Black and still have a sense of humanity and joy. And so when you lead an organization which is already very stressful, and you lead an organization that's based on bringing spirit, energy, vitality to communities, what does that mean now to be a person of color in that position? And sometimes that means like taking on a lot, being a support for your colleagues, managing your staff through very difficult racial times. I love my funders, but sometimes funders think we can do a lot more with a lot less. We can't do more with less. We need more to do more, right? And so I think that those are things that are challenging. It is a tax. It's extra energy that we always have to expend being leaders of color. And I think that if we do not, and if we're not conscious of it, what will happen is we will burn out, and the field cannot afford to lose us, right? So while I think this is wonderful that we're having the circle, and part of the reason why we created the circle is because we didn't want to burn out and because we wanted to support each other. But we also have to be careful that we don't put undue pressure and stress on leaders of color without the proper resources to match what we're asking for, because then we put them in a position to burn out. And then I think the entire field and movement loses in the end. So I think that is one of the challenges. I think, one of the great things now is that, yeah, absolutely showing up in your fullness and leading. And I love the fact that we can have a diversity of answers. We can have a diversity of experiences to the table. I love the fact that I can create real opportunities, real leadership pipelines for people. One of the most challenging things about being a person of color is opportunity. Where do you get an opportunity to shine, to make mistakes, to grow as a professional? And I think I'm in a position now, and along with my other colleagues on this phone, we're in a position now where we can create those opportunities. That is exciting. It's part of the reason why I got into this work. And so I love that opportunity. We can create internships, hire people first time people in the field, to give people real life experiences working with, you know, leaders in community development. It's a huge responsibility as leaders of color to not just create an opportunity for us in real time, but to also think about who's coming after us in the leadership pipeline. And so I think that that's an exciting time for us, an exciting opportunity, and one that I'm really leaning into as a leader now.
All
Can I
right,
add
thank
one
you.
little thing on that, Scott?
Sure thing, Calvin.
And Akila mentioned, internships and alike, but she's done this and I did this as well, as you know. One of the first things I did at Smart Growth was elevate 2 people of color to vice president roles. And they were already exemplary, but oftentimes you'll have moments where people of color are in organizations and don't necessarily get the look, as one might say, or get the opportunity to shine at that next level, or it takes a long time, or they have to do 12 times the things to get the same opportunity. So it also gives us a chance to lift up exemplary people of color within organizations as well, when they're deserved, and give them that shot to shine and be the leaders that they can be. And we need to do all of that. So
Leaders helping people lead. That's a great thing. That's a really great thing. And it looks like we're getting Maurice back. Well, we're gonna there he is. Hey Maurice, are you available to answer that first question? Reward and challenge being a leader of color.
Sorry, I lost you there for a second on my internet. I think the rewards right now, can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
I think I would say on the rewards piece, it is nice to be leading now at a time when there is an opportunity to re-choose again, to really focus on issues related to racial wealth, health, and opportunity gaps. It is a great place to be able to lead an organization and to help that organization be bold in this moment, because this moment, as we all know, is not going to last in perpetuity. And so I feel real blessed in being in a position at this moment to push an organization with some capacity to really be bold, to fight the good fight during this moment. Honestly, the downside is there just not enough hours in the day. I just wish I had more hours and more days during the week to actually work on this stuff, because I feel the urgency, and I feel the real desire to try to do everything that we can in this moment to make progress, because there will be a reaction to this. And so we got to go as far as we can go to withstand the reaction. And so that's really the downside. I'd like more time. I'd like longer days. But otherwise, in all honesty, I feel incredibly blessed to be at this place at this time.
All right. So let's stay on this. And I'm going to flip the question. The calls for racial equity, in housing, in employment, in entrepreneurial pursuits, in education, and life outcomes for Black, Indigenous, and peoples of color, it instills fear in a lot of folks, and not just the usual suspects. The fear, as it's been framed, is in order to achieve racial equity, it's a zero-sum game, like Heather McGee is talking about in her new book. That the pie is only so big, and therefore my slice will essentially have to be smaller, because, or that I will have to cede power. And I wanted to follow up on this idea that Brandy raised earlier about the model of collaboration that has come out of the CEO circle. Because I was really, really curious that, you've sort of come together seeing that the sum of your coordination or your collaboration may be greater than the sum of your individual parts. And so I'm just curious, where did this sort of radical notion come from? And where could it take us as a sector and maybe even as a society by paying attention to your intention?
Well, I'll say a couple of things, but all roads do lead back to Akila and Lisa in this regard. That's the actually real story, and Akila can share. But I'll say two things. One is, there's a saying, I believe it's an African proverb, that none of us is as strong as all of us. And I think we, in bringing ourselves together, think that to be true. And if we think about how do we create better impact for communities and actually even do better within our organizations, the more we can work together and collaborate. And as Marietta said earlier, there's healthy competition. That's all fine. That's all good. But ultimately, the aggregate result will be our organizations will do better. We'll do better as CEOs, and we'll have better, and I would say accelerated aggregate impact to the communities we serve. And I think we just all believe that. And you needed, and this is why, and Akila can talk about how we sort of curated the group, you needed folks who had that mentality, because not every CEO has that mentality that we can grow the pie. We can actually create new pies. So we don't have to worry about who's getting a slice, because these are a whole new set of pies. And so we all have that mindset to sort of play in the sandbox together. And once you do that and believe that we can accelerate and extrapolate our impact, the sky's the limit.
Yeah, I think Calvin is absolutely right. One of the things, I want to just point out is, you ever did something because it was just the right thing to do and you didn't necessarily have any sort of rate of return attached to it? You just did it because that's what you needed to do. And I felt like the CEO circle was like that. So, when we started, I think, a lot of people were like, okay, so what are you guys going to be? Are you guys going to be like a back room? Are you guys gonna be this policy conglomerate? Like, what are you guys going to do? Like, what's the agenda? And I remember when, we were reaching out and trying to pull everybody together for this infamous free meal that Maurice talked about. I think I saved some nickels and dimes for it. But the deal is, I wanted to make sure, and I, point to my other colleagues, that we didn't have an agenda, that we came with full transparency, vulnerability, and a willingness to at least commit to getting to know each other. Because the bottom line is, we had to like each other. That's the first step. Like, we couldn't just jump in and start working. And yes, we have this higher idea of leveraging resources, of collaborating, bringing the full power of us all being leaders of color, and seeing in our respective communities how people have worked together under immense circumstances. Absolutely, that was part of all of our creation stories, right? But I think it was important for us to understand who these men and women were, what motivated them, what drove them to be leaders, and what sort of supports did they need. And so that was our first year. We didn't have any kind of big agenda items. We didn't work on anything huge. We really just decided we were going to be vulnerable, transparent, and get to know each other and figure out. And it takes time.
And let me tell you, I still don't really like Maurice. He's still barely in my, circle right now. So, So, and I will say, Maurice, I mean, it's amazing that you, Liz, decided, because you remember we had this whole conversation about, does it make sense for Liz to be part of this group? And you were like, girl, yes. You got a board, you got a staff, we dealing with the same issues. Like, we got to support each other. And we talked through this stuff. And I just want to say this, and I'm going to kick it over to Maurice, where we serve on each other's boards. We work on different partnerships together. I work with Liz in various markets. Maurice wanted to go into certain markets. I gave him all the intelligence I had. He's sharing with me what's going on in certain markets. Calvin is on my board. He served on my board for 3 years. I mean, Tony and I have worked together on numerous national affordable housing organizations. Marietta and I work together. At least we work together. And that was the first step. Let's build trust. Let me kick it over to Maurice.
I love Calvin myself, so I clearly got some work to do there, but I'm a huge fan of him, so I just want to put that out there. Look, I also want to echo something that Calvin said. We came together because the women in this group took the initiative and said, "Bring your trifling behind down here." So we can get together. I mean, let's just put it out there. That the unsung heroes of the circle are the women. Just like the unsung heroes of the civil rights movement were the women. It's the same thing here. They really, they basically rose above indifference and reached out and said, "Will you come?" I came because I was invited, but they didn't have to invite. And so I gotta, this is like one of these simple lessons in life. Just invite the person, right? You want to get together, invite them, and they did it. So I wanna just really tip my hat to that. The other piece of what you asked though is, what does this mean for the future? It means that more of us should be inviting others to the table, right? These are like we gotta overcome our indifference, right? Indifference is what kept this from happening sooner. That's what kept this from happening sooner. So I really want to applaud Akilah and Lisa, and Marietta and crew for issuing the invitation and overcoming the indifference that we all have as we're going about our lives with not enough time in the day. They paused and did this, and I'm grateful to them.
All right, this is the lightning round question. 30 seconds a person. So, whenever you talk with funders, funders always, the records of request is that you're always looking for resources, right? And that's reasonable. But what's one other thing that you could use in your work or in your organization that would enable you to accelerate the goal toward a more equitable future for people, the communities we care about?
You said 30 seconds. Well,
Yeah.
I gotta say, operating support. That was 4 seconds. But then secondly, I would say doing more to partner us with like-minded organizations. Not all of us know all of us. And I think sometimes it's assumed, and Scott, you've done that for me, where you've said, "Hey, did you know this person was working on these set of issues? Let me do this introduction." That's a resource that's not financial, but it's opening your network, not just your resource. And then finally, I would say coaching and other supportive infrastructure, and maybe funding that, or at least giving us, access to a network of that, whether it's sales pitches, executive coaches, and the like, to help us with our capacity and our journey.
Yeah, and I agree with Cal. So just so you know, Jerry Maldonado, I want to give you a shout out and forward. One is that they have paid for me to get an executive coach. That is important. When we look
Jerry, let's talk.
when we look at what makes executives successful, they need people that are willing to push them, get into their minds, and really, have them kind of go past their comfort zone. So I really want to give kudos to the Ford Foundation through the Build program for that support. And then the other thing is using your resources to elevate and amplify our message. We are working with the Ford Foundation right now, myself and Grounded Solutions, to use for them to help us through their media outlets, right? Them helping us write op-eds or do podcasts and being able to post them and send them through their networks is more powerful than us being able to do that by ourselves, right? So, using those essential resources that we don't necessarily have the capacity for as a small nonprofit is so important and so pivotal to our success. So thank you. I want to give a special shout out to Ford on that one.
So you said other than resources, right? What do we want? All right, so I'll take money off the table. Two things, 30 seconds. One is speed. Tell me yes or no as fast as you can so I can move on if it's no. And boy, I can't tell you how long the cycle often takes. It's and that's, by the way, that's taking resources from us. Secondly is use your position to try to change the system. In other words, PPP should have been using CDFIs from day one, and people with proximity to policymakers should have been telling them, you can't just use banks. You're going to leave out 99% of BIPOC-led businesses that don't have traditional relationships with banks. We need people in influential positions to let folks know that the system that they're thinking of is way too narrow if they want to achieve equity.
Thank you. I think I'm going to be turning this back to Hala, but thanks very much for your honesty and your integrity in all this. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Scott.
Thank you, Scott, for your leadership and for moderating this amazing group of leaders. It is now my role to transition and to introduce Mr. Jerry Maldonado, one of probably my favorite people, Director, Cities and States for the Ford Foundation. Jerry's not just a colleague, he's also a friend. And he's joined Ford as a program manager in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina and Rita, overseeing the implementation of the foundation's cross-program Gulf Coast Transformation Initiative as a program officer, and then as a senior program officer. His grant-making focused on integrated regional strategies for building stronger communities by improving access for low-income families to permanently affordable housing, reducing blight, improving transit choices, and strengthening decent work opportunities. Over the past decade, he has developed and managed innovative place-based grant-making strategies in San Diego, New Orleans, Atlanta, New York, and Puerto Rico, and facilitated the creation of multi-issue cross-sector grantee collaboratives that strengthen civic engagement and advanced inclusive local development. And he has played the lead role in mobilizing local, regional, and national philanthropy around strategies aimed at democratizing urban development and promoting more inclusive policies that protect and advance the rights of low-income communities and communities of color. Please join me.
Who's that, Hala?
I know, it's a lot. We've done a lot. I'm so impressed. Welcome. Thank you for joining us so much.
Always great to be with one of my favorite partners in crime and philanthropy, Hala, and a set of my favorite partners. One, this conversation has been fantastic so far today. And Tony, Marietta, and Lisa, I am really excited to have a few minutes with you all this afternoon to really continue to look forward, right? To take kind of Akila's challenge, right? Where she really said, that oftentimes, leaders of color aren't afforded an opportunity to really dream, right? And to dream big, right? And I think that it's important for us to reflect on the moment that we're in, that we're at this important crossroads. Tony, you said that this crossroads requires disruption, right? It requires radical reimagination. And it requires that because we're dealing with multiple overlapping crises, right? A pandemic, a housing crisis, a racial justice reckoning. So I'd love to kind of open with having you each reflect on kind of this moment of opportunity, right? And would really love to hear from you all, what you see as some of the really game-changing, bold ideas that are important for you all to continue to take on as a collective within the CEO circle to really address some of these underlying kind of racial justice inequalities that drive inequality in the built environment. And really think about that in the context of the opportunities that are afforded by a new administration, right? So what are those big, bold ideas that you would want to advance collectively? And how do we take advantage of this moment with this federal opening? I'll start with Tony, then Lisa and Marietta.
Thanks, Jerry. And I just want to start off by saying we just need to also acknowledge that all of us are really part of a struggle to really expand our anti-racist thinking. And that's really the core of it. We've been conditioned to sort of accept the status quo and tinker with that. So when you talk about bold thinking, it's really an exercise to move away from that and really create a set of actionable strategies with the policies to match that. And when I say policies, I mean at the local, state, and federal level. I think one of the really sort of key things that happened recently, and again, I'll say thanks to Ford for supporting it, Community Change really reached out and assembled experts across the housing sector and developed what they call the New Deal for Housing Justice Policy Playbook. And we got the chance to insert some input into that playbook. And really it captures what I think are some of the most forward-thinking approaches and questions that we need to be answering and trying to address in this policy moment with the new administration. So two big things I will just highlight from that and that are really sort of foremost in my brain right now is delivering a COVID-19 relief package that really speaks to remedying the housing insecurity of people of color, really understanding that health and housing, that those are so intertwined. And so how do we really focus federal policy to address that? The other thing is centering racial housing justice in the president's first budget. I want that to be like a laser focus on making sure that happens. The other piece of this is really understanding that expanding access to homeownership is really crucial to addressing the racial wealth gap. And you know, we're doing that in multiple ways. We've partnered with City and our CLT Accelerator. I just want to shout out to Lisa and her team at the National Fair Housing Alliance. They're really focusing on ways to strengthen affirmatively furthering fair housing policy and the use of the special purpose credit program to support our work in shared equity housing. This idea of communal ownership and benefit is a complete 360-degree turn from where we have been as a country. So I just want us to kind of stay focused on that in order to really scale it and make it happen in a tangible way for folks. And one of the methods that Keela and I have partnered together on is we've advocated for and we've gotten introduced the Restoring Communities Left Behind Act already in the House. And really that would call for $5 billion a year for the next 10 years, really focused on community development support for the communities that need it most. And most of those will be communities of color, as we know from the data that has been put in front of us for the last year and beyond that. So I just really think this connection of racial justice to changing the housing system, and people have talked about it earlier, it was designed to disadvantage Black, Brown, Indigenous people from the beginning. So this is our chance to put some justice behind writing that.
Right on. I mean, centering racial justice as community, right? As the cornerstones of a new federal agenda, critical. And Lisa, this is really kind of a pillar of the work that you have been doing for a long time. Would love your reflections.
Yeah, and first of all, let me say off the bat that I love Tony and Marietta and all the rest of the members of my CEO circle. So I just want to set that record straight. I love Maurice too. I have double love for Maurice to make up for Calvin's lack of love.
We'll take it up with Calvin later.
Yeah. Yeah. So Jerry, I think that you said something that we all really focused on when we came together, because not too long after we started the CEO circle, the COVID pandemic hit, right? And one of the things that we all realized is that in this moment, not only are we facing the health pandemic, as you said, it's really a triple pandemic. The economic pandemic, it's a quadruple pandemic, the housing pandemic, and then the pandemic of racism that has plagued us since before the inception of this nation. So realizing that, I think we all knew that what we really wanted to see in terms of changing the game was systems change. We wanted a housing and finance system that works for communities of color, because right now the housing and finance systems do not work for communities of color. The current landscape is deeply inequitable. And what that means is when we implement any type of benefit or relief, like the CARES Act, we're pushing out these benefits and relief in a structure and system that is fundamentally unjust and unfair, and that perpetuates disparate outcomes. And that's why the CARES Act today is exacerbating inequality in America. Inequality begets inequality. And so we know as a collective, as a CEO circle, we want to change that. And that takes a bevy of policies and practices that we have to change. Oh, think about it this way. Since before the inception of this nation, we have spent trillions and trillions of dollars, and we have passed thousands of laws, regulations, and ordinances to create a systemically unfair, unjust, inequitable, racist system. We're not going to overcome those centuries of unjust and unfair policies and hundreds of trillions of dollars spent to create this system of injustice. We're not gonna overcome that in 1 year and with $1 billion, right? So we know we are in it for the long haul. The other game-changing thing that I think we landed on really early on, Jerry, was that we don't want communities of color to bounce back from this COVID pandemic to where they were before the pandemic struck. We want communities to bounce back stronger, and we want them to land in a place that is more equitable. And we're really singular in agreement on that issue. I think we hit up on that, Jerry, because all of our organizations, when the COVID pandemic hit, we were still working on the ground in communities throughout the country that have not yet bounced back from the Great Recession. And we're profoundly aware that communities of color will not bounce back from the COVID pandemic. There's nothing in place in terms of structures or systems that will result in Black and Brown communities coming out of this crisis in a resilient way. So we know that we want to enable those communities to land in a more equitable place. And then, as Tony said, the last thing that I'll mention is that we are all aligned around affirmatively furthering fair housing. This is something that it's been on the book for over 50 years, but it has never been enforced in our nation. And we're all aligned around that game-changing idea of transforming communities from places that lack opportunity and that are opportunity deserts to ensuring that every community in the United States is an opportunity-rich community, and that everyone is living in an affordable, stable home.
Thank you, Lisa. Marietta.
Thank you. I agree with the comments both Tina and Lisa said. I'd like to take a couple of them a little bit further. I absolutely agree that we are in this moment in time and we need to leverage the momentum of everything that is going on in communities, but it's going to take some time, and it's going to take resources, and it's going to take a long coordinated effort to change, to create the kind of systemic change that's going to be required to solve the challenges, the hurdles, the obstacles that communities of color have been facing for decades. So I think we have to right size that, but that doesn't mean that we can't start today, that we can't continue this work. I think I would like to double down on how we are able to resource communities of color to achieve homeownership. Homeownership is one of a handful of strategies that can create generational wealth for families. And I think that we need to really think about how we do that across the economic spectrum. We hear a lot right now about the homeownership gap for Black and Latin and Hispanic, Asian and Native American populations, and how we can close that gap. I think the challenge is not only how do we close that gap, but how do we keep that gap closed? And I think that there's a variety of things that need to happen across the economic spectrum, including thinking about how people buy homes, but how do we prepare and get them ready to buy that first home so that it really does create an opportunity for generational wealth. Things like, how do lenders and realtors, how are they compensated on the affordable side of the market? Often it's through the sale of the house, which incentivizes larger home prices. On the affordable side of the market, that sort of, they often can get, a first-time home buyer can often get not great service as a result. How do we change that compensation structure? How do we take a look at traditional federal subsidies, such as community development block grants or home funds? Are there changes and updates and modernization of those regulations to make it easier to be used for affordable development, to make it easier for cities and municipalities to use those resources to promote and incentivize affordable home ownership and down payment assistance and home buyer preparation? How do we resource systems that potential homeowners can use and access to understand the impact and how they can manage their credit more effectively? How can we help a generation of students and graduates manage their student loan debt in a more favorable and equitable way? There's a whole almost in every sector, there are things we can think about that can really help begin to remedy some of these challenges. How do we incentivize the private sector to build and repair homes that add supply on the affordable side and add inventory? So many markets right now have an incredible lack of affordable inventory. So if we really want to commit to this, I think we need to look at across the board, what are the kinds of systemic policy changes that we need to work on systemically, but also in the private sector? And how do we incentivize businesses to do that? We are very fortunate in many respects that we have the world of philanthropy and corporate foundations that are committed to this work. I think there is some work to be done there too, in that for corporate foundations who are funding this work, let's build alignment around this kind of work and where we're trying to get to, so that your same corporation that's funding this work isn't on the other side of the corporation investing in business that's undoing this work at the same time.
That's right. And Marietta, I want to tie something that you said. It was something that Lisa said that I think is really important. Lisa, you said that this is a moment to not just bring us back to where we were, right? Just really leapfrog, right? And to make sure that individual families and communities of color, right, are in kind of a stronger position and in full control of their own destiny, right? And Merida, that means kind of rethinking not just how we build individual wealth, but how we build community wealth, right? And these are things that both kind of Grounded Solutions, right, CCP, NeighborWorks, we've been grappling with. How do we, yes, address kind of the individual's kind of housing issue, but within a much broader community context, right? Because one without the other is insufficient and can lead to all sorts of distortions in the market. Yeah. So having said that, that's a big challenge, right? And someone in the chat mentioned that kind of what you're doing is really trying to think about how we rebuild kind of a movement, right? That connects these dots. And the CEO Circle in many aspects represents different components of that historic housing justice movement, right? You know, we've had the fair housing, the strategic litigation, the community development, the finance, the smart growth. All of you represent different aspects of a movement. So looking ahead, I'd love for you all to kind of reflect back on the kinds of investments that you think are critical, right? To continue to help build your shared infrastructure, to continue to advance this work together. Lisa, I'll start with you, then Marietta, and then we'll end up with Tony.
Yeah, so we kind of touched on this already, Jerry, right? We know it is going to take a lot of resources, and this is a long-term commitment. And so what we need is for supporters to be there with us for the long haul. And that means investing in the vision and investing in the mission. And understanding that systems change does take a while. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have victories along the way. We definitely do. We've already talked about a lot of victories, right? But one of the things that I've noticed is that in other movements, right, for change, for systems change, investors are there for the long term and support the operations of the organization in order to really effectuate the kind of change that needs to be made. We don't get that in the civil rights community. It's like, change it right now, overnight. What do you mean? You're still segregated? What's wrong with you? And so what we need is for all of our stakeholders and supporters to understand really how deep this is ingrained, how deep an inequality is ingrained in every single system in our nation, and that it takes all of us working together to make that change and create the change that we all want to see.
Thank you, Lisa. Marietta?
I couldn't agree more. I think that there is so much investment that needs to be made, but let's even put the money aside. I think this notion of alignment around what's the change that we really want to see. How are we going to collectively come together around an agreed upon agenda so that we can all do our part to leverage the resources that exist to really tackle these structural issues and structures that have enabled this kind of inequity for decades. I think that's really critical. In the earlier panel, there was a comment of Calvin saying that he's really excited because we can it's okay to talk about race, and we have to be able to talk about it openly. We have to be able to acknowledge the history, as Lisa has said, that led us to this point. And we have to together link arms and acknowledge that we are facing, this movement is facing a new maturation. It's a new set of issues, but we're held back by our history. We need to acknowledge that and really think about it systemically. I think one of the things that I think is different now that I would just say is I see a lot more cross-sectoral collaboration, right? Housing and finance used to be in a little bit of a silo, education in a silo, even healthcare. I see a lot more cross-sector collaboration, and that gives me a lot of hope. And I think we need to break down those barriers and really think about it collectively across the community, just as you described, about how do we think about individual and community wealth in tandem.
Yeah, and Marietta and Lisa, I'll also just say that it requires philanthropy also to reflect on how it funds, right? And whether our funding actually inadvertently fuels competition and scarcity that's negative, right? Or actually creates a fertile ground to support the kind of movement building that you're engaged in. Tony, bring us home, because I see Hala's waiting for us in the wings.
Yeah, I just want to say, I think in summation, in my mind, what I'm hearing is that we need to activate the kind of, and I'll call it power sharing, that's needed for equitable place-based work driven by people of color making decisions and controlling land and resources to actually function and become the norm rather than the exception, and recognizing we as leaders of color and community development are on the front line of that change. So we're asking philanthropy to help us with supporting co-design for new resources, including CDFI, social impact investors, and others.
Thank you all so much for a really great conversation. I'm going to pass it to Hala, who will now bring us home.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our leaders and to our moderator, Jerry. We really appreciate all of your input and your brilliance. And we hope that you stay with us. We're running a little over time, but we think it's definitely worth it. And we're ready to conclude. So please, let's resume with the questions. Some of you posed some questions that we are going to try to answer. I think that with the time limitation, we have time for one question, I believe. And I think Jerry or Scott will help us answer it.
Can I just say one thing while Jerry and Scott are teeing up the question? Because Marietta hit on something on a point that I don't want us to lose. And that is we need to have alignment around the change that we want to see. That's so important. Because one of the things we've experienced, right, is that the change that people of color want to see for themselves has not always aligned with the change that people that the predominantly white society wants to see for us. So an example of that is happening right now around access to credit. And I've heard lots of people say, oh, well, we're gonna basically set a system so that people of color can access FHA mortgages and be steered to the FHA market. And what I hear people of color saying is we want access to the entire mortgage market. We want conventional loans and FHA loans so that we can have the whole panoply of access, not being funneled into one area of opportunity. And so that is so critical. And I think we need to recognize and agree that in terms of aligning and sort of landing on the systems change we want to see, that it has to be driven by the people. We can't be dictating to people and community what they need or what they want. We can't be paternalistic about it. They have to drive that decisioning and visioning.
Lisa, that is a fantastic cue up for kind of the final question, rapid round, because we've talked a lot about race and we haven't talked about power explicitly. We haven't said power explicitly, right? So I would love for you all quickly to reflect on what is a recommendation that you would have for transforming power, right? To advance the outcomes that we've talked about, a recommendation you have for any sector, the community development sector, philanthropy, or the corporate sector, or the public sector. The easy questions. I'm gonna go with Akilah because you're in the middle.
You're muted, Akilah.
And then Akilah, you get to pass the baton.
I get to pass the baton. Look, it is about power sharing, and power is about control over those resources. We don't just want you to put equity statements up on your website. I don't want you to make any sort of kind of symbolic, gestures. We need real resources so we can build power, real financial resources at the scale of the problem we are trying to solve. I'm going to kick it over to Calvin.
I'll use a quote. Wherever there's people, there's power. See if anybody knows that one. I think one way we can build power is to not individualize our movement and allow and fund and resource and back networks so that we can have peer knowledge sharing and peer learning and that collective. And I say that, and Lisa knows this as well, when you do federal, local, and state advocacy, or you're just trying to build up the capacity in communities, sometimes that best practice sharing, that knowledge sharing has to happen as a network or a coalition or as a group, rather than sort of funding or supporting or providing technical assistance just to one group. And so I think that network coalition, that movement strategy is a way to power.
Pass the baton, Calvin.
I'm gonna pass the baton to my new favorite person in this group. That would be Maurice Jones.
I'm so speechless. I forgot the question after that. Listen, I'm gonna have to jump off right after this. If you want to get into power, attack what produces intergenerational wealth. Close the home ownership gap for whites and people of color, and do it in the next 5 to 10 years max. That's how you engender power. Now, I apologize. I'm powerless. I got to go to my next meeting. So
Thank you, Maurice.
all the best to everybody.
Thanks. So I'll take the liberty and pass it to Marietta.
I would agree with all of that. I would echo something that Lisa said earlier, and that is we really need to find ways to elevate the resident voice. Let's not a resident's voice in communities. Let's not assume we know what the remedies or what their desires are, but let's give them a voice. And in many ways, a homeowner has a very different voice in their community than that of a renter. And we need to find a way to create an opportunity for all voices to be heard in communities.
Beautiful. Lisa and Tony?
I've already spoken on it. Tony.
Hey, you heard what I said.
You can speak again.
All I know, Jerry, and again, I just want to say, we want to collaborate with the funders, the partners on the ground, the organizers. We really want everybody to be at the table to design something that everyone can buy into. That's really important. That aspect of trust is missing from so many aspects of what we currently have. And if we're going to try to reimagine it, redevelop it, push it further than it's ever gone before, we got to start with that basis of trust. And, you know, last year I had this Twitter hashtag that was like, where are the funders? And I wasn't calling anybody out. I was asking a question like, hey, I know what I'm thinking about these issues. Where are you all? Talk to us about what you're thinking, what you're prioritizing, where you're going, and let's sit down together and figure out how to create something that we can all buy into.
Okay, Jerry, I'm going to sound like a dead horse, beating a dead horse, but I just feel compelled to point out that the affirmatively furthering fair housing process it is hinged on effective, active community engagement. It is designed and structured so that community identifies what are the barriers to opportunity and what are the solutions that we want to see implemented. What do we want our world that we live in to look like? And to me, that's extremely powerful. And I think that's one of the reasons, quite frankly, why affirmatively furthering fair housing has never been enforced.
Powerful. Thank you all. Calvin?
Nope.
Do you want to jump in? Okay. I'll pass it to Hala to close this up. But again, thank you guys for this fantastic conversation. Hala?
Thank you, Jerry. Sincere and heartfelt thank you to our amazing CEOs who are incredibly inspiring, thoughtful, and very powerful. And of course, to our amazing moderators who led this conversation and made it possible. If you stayed with us for the event, thank you. And we hope that it was productive and useful for you. Goodbye. Bye-bye.